The dawn over the Westwall was the colour of iron. Frost glazed the dragon's teeth, and the wire between them tinkled faintly in the wind that came out of the Hurtgen forest. Second Lieutenant Alan Rains, forward observer for the 322nd Field Artillery Battalion, knelt in a shell crater that looked down on a row of German bunkers near Schevenhütte. His breath fogged the lenses of his binoculars. Somewhere behind him, a field phone hissed. The voice from Fire Direction Center came thin and flat through the line. Fire mission regimental time on target. Rains repeated the words automatically, but the 3 syllables, time on target, always tightened his chest. He had seen what they meant. In the first 10 seconds of a barrage, the world changed shape. Men who had been visible a moment before vanished under columns of smoke and dirt, and the air itself seemed to harden. The trick, as infantry called it, was simple to explain and terrifying to save. A witness. Each American gun position, from the little 105mm howitzers to the heavy 155s, received firing data that told them exactly how long their shells would take to reach the target. The difference in flight time, 30 seconds from the nearest battery, 45 from 110 miles back, was calculated to the 10th of a second. Gunners then waited, watches synchronized, fingers on lanyards. When the final time signal came, fire. Every gun in the regiment fired at once, so that shells from all directions arrived together. To men in the bunkers, it felt not like an attack beginning, but like the world ending in a single heartbeat. That was the purpose. Most artillery kills happened before the enemy moved, before they even knew they were under fire. The first 10 seconds of shock tore apart organization, cut field phones, buried weapons, and smothered breath. Rains had seen German counter-batteries that never got off a shot because their crews were still crawling out of collapsed dugouts when the second volley hit. He lifted his field glasses again. Through the morning haze, the pillboxes of the Westwall looked squat and harmless, their embrasures dark as empty sockets. Infantry of the 83rd Division waited below, huddled in foxholes that steamed faintly. They would not move until the barrage lifted. The fire direction net crackled again. Shot out time on target -30. The words moved down the line, each battery, each gun crew repeating them like a litany. In the fields behind Stolberg, the gun pits were already alive. Gunners' mates swung powder bags like sacks of flour. Loaders heaved the long olive-drab shells into open breeches. At each emplacement, a second lieutenant crouched over his watch, counting backward. 10 seconds before the mark, 100 lanyards drew taut. The synchronized barrage of a modern army was less an act of courage than of mathematics. When the hands reached 0, Rains heard it, a flat, distant thunder rolling toward him. He felt it in the soles of his boots before he saw the flashes. The shells arrived together. First, a single pulse of sound that cracked the air like glass, then a pressure wave that shoved dirt against his face. Across the slope, every bunker vanished into geysers of smoke and flying concrete. The earth trembled like a living thing. Rains pressed the field phone to his ear. "On target," he reported calmly, though the line quivered in his hand. Somewhere beneath the smoke, men were dying in exact synchronization with the watches of the American gun crews. That was the secret of the time on target. No registration fire, no warning rounds. The first explosion the enemy heard was already inside their perimeter. The technique had been born from frustration. In the early days of North Africa, gunners often needed half a dozen ranging rounds to find their mark, each one advertising their position and giving defenders time to scatter. By 1943, the fire direction centers of the U.S. Army had solved it, with slide rules and discipline. Every battery kept precise meteorological data, temperature, wind velocity, barometric pressure, and used them to compute corrections so exact that their first rounds landed within 20 yards of the aiming point. Combine that with synchronized watches, and an artillery regiment could deliver 500 shells to one grid square in less than 10 seconds. To the infantry crawling toward the Siegfried Line, it felt like divine intervention. They called it the hand of God. When the barrage came, German bunkers that had held for weeks simply disappeared. Even when the reinforced concrete survived, The concussion sheared bolts, crushed hinges, and suffocated crews. The blast of 155mm shells, striking at once, turned bunkers into tombs, sealed by their own shock waves. As the dust rolled back, Rains raised his binoculars again. Where a machine gun embrasure had glimmered seconds before, there was now a ragged hole exhaling smoke. The roof of the bunker had lifted slightly, then settled askew like a broken jaw. He keyed the phone again. "Target neutralized," he said. "Shift left 200. The fire direction officer, miles to the rear, noted the adjustment, turned to his plotting board, and murmured new coordinates. Around him, enlisted men recalculated azimuths and powder charges. The message travelled out to batteries spread over 10 miles of muddy forest, and once again the ritual began. Powder bags, shells, synchronized watches. The gunners of the United States Army were not merely soldiers, they were watchmakers of destruction. Historians would later call time on target the purest expression of American artillery science, born from precision, not passion. Each gun captain knew to the second when his round must be in flight, and each battery commander carried a stopwatch, whose sweep matched the master chronometer at battalion headquarters. The accuracy was astonishing. At Bastogne months later, observers recorded shells landing so simultaneously that enemy prisoners believed new secret weapons were being used, rockets or gas bombs, because no human fire control could do that. Back on the slope near Schevenhütte, Rains watched infantry rise from the ground and advance between the smoking craters. The 10 seconds of terror had done its work. Here and there, a German gun spat a defiant burst, quickly smothered by another ripple of explosions. The pattern repeated itself all along the front that autumn of 1944. A brief stillness, a whispered command, and then a regiment's worth of mathematics turned into sound and fury. Later that evening, when the guns cooled and the infantry held the line they had taken, Rains wrote in his notebook, "The first 10 seconds decide everything." He did not add that it haunted him the thought that war could be reduced to timing tables and trigonometry, that victory might depend less on courage than on the precision of a corporal's watch. But as long as the Westwall stood ahead, he would keep calling the numbers. Somewhere beyond the dark ridge, other observers were doing the same, synchronizing seconds that would erase more bunkers before the hour was out. The artillerymen of the United States Army had discovered their secret: kill not by weight of fire over time, but by time itself compressed into 10 perfect, simultaneous seconds. And in those seconds, the line between science and annihilation disappeared. The secret to destroying a bunker without ever seeing it was not magic, it was geometry perfected under fire. By the autumn of 1944, American artillery had turned mathematics into a weapon as lethal as any shell it hurled. The enemy hid behind hills, forests, and walls of concrete. The United States Army simply erased those obstacles with computation. Every gun crew on the Western Front fought on a map. 1,000 grid squares stretched across Belgium and Germany like invisible windows, each defined by letters and numbers that an observer could read as coordinates and a fire direction center could convert into elevation and azimuth. The observer's job was no longer to point and guess, it was to measure. When Lieutenant Alan Rains called for fire, he did it through a language of precision. 6 digits, correction in mils, a code for ammunition type, and finally the time of flight data that made the entire orchestra play in harmony. What made this possible was a network that stretched from treetop observation posts to theodolite towers far behind the lines. Survey teams, the quiet architects of destruction, moved ahead of every advance, mapping each gun position with transit and plane table until their location was known within a few yards. Sound-ranging sections placed microphones miles apart along cables, recording the echoes of enemy guns. Flash-spotting teams plotted muzzle flares by triangulation at night. When combined, these data created an invisible topography of the battlefield more accurate than any paper map. The Germans still believed in line-of-sight warfare. Their forward observers needed to see the target to adjust fire. Americans, by contrast, had learned to kill by coordinates. They could destroy a position hidden behind a ridge as easily as one in the open, because geometry ignored geography. That was the quiet revolution of 1944. Over the Westwall, the trick matured. Each artillery battalion fed its position into a master grid. When a target was spotted, say, a bunker mouth glimpsed for 1 second between smoke and trees, the observer's bearings and distance were fed into the fire direction center. 3 men with slide rules transformed those numbers into firing data for every gun in the regiment. The computation took less than 2 minutes. When the shells arrived, they did so from every direction and every range, meeting above the target as if drawn by fate. Rains had watched it evolve from clumsy beginnings in Normandy. Back then, the maps had been imprecise, the guns scattered, and observers sometimes guessed wrong by hundreds of yards. But by the drive to the Rhine, the artillery net had become a living organism. Every battery commander knew the other's positions, their tube lengths, even their powder lots. Every chronometer was checked twice a day against the master clock at Corps headquarters, synchronized by radio signal from London. In effect, the entire Allied artillery in northwest Europe was one machine, spread across hundreds of miles, united by mathematics and discipline. A corporal with a stopwatch in Belgium could trigger destruction in Luxembourg before his echo faded. The Germans, hearing that thunder, often thought they faced hundreds of guns. In truth, it might be 30, coordinated so precisely that their salvos overlapped like ripples on a pond. The results on the ground were astonishing. At Aachen, American engineers discovered bunkers whose periscopes had been sheared clean off by the converging angles of time-on-target fire. Crews inside never heard the first explosion. The air pressure alone killed them. One report described a position where every man was found dead at his post, the instruments untouched. The concussion had turned lungs to pulp without moving a stone. In post-war interrogations, captured German artillery officers admitted they could not match the system. Their range tables were good, their guns excellent, but their organization was built for independent batteries, not a single coordinated net. A German colonel said bitterly, "They make war by mathematics. We make it by men." The Americans were perfectly content with that distinction. They trusted arithmetic more than heroism. It was arithmetic that let a gunner in the First Army drop a shell on a moving target he would never see, guided by an observer who might be 10 miles away and speaking through a broken wire. It was arithmetic that allowed a regiment to shift fire from one bunker to another in under 60 seconds, with no need for visual adjustment. And it was arithmetic that made every hill and forest irrelevant. To Rains, who sat in his forward crater with a map folded like a prayer book, it felt like watching the earth itself obey equations. He would mark a point, whisper 6 digits, and then the world at that coordinate simply ceased to exist. The illusion of terrain, the idea that a hill could shield you, was gone. The gunners had stolen that from the landscape. At noon that day, as the infantry pushed forward through the shattered wire, Rains heard a new call on the net. Counter-battery target. Moving fire for effect. Grid 142687. He looked up, saw nothing but smoke, and smiled grimly. Somewhere far behind, men he had never met were already adjusting their sights, setting fuses, and marking watches. They did not need to see what they would destroy. In another minute, the thunder would come, and geography would mean nothing at all. The name came from the infantry. To them, the M12 gun motor carriage was the door knocker, the weapon that rapped on a bunker's steel door and blew it open before anyone inside could answer. In official tables, it was classified as self-propelled 155mm gun Monet on M3 chassis, but to the soldiers crawling through the Siegfried Line in the autumn of 1944, it was salvation made of armor plate and recoil cylinders. Lieutenant Alan Rains saw his first one outside Stolberg, a week after the Westwall bombardment that had erased the ridge line. The vehicle rumbled out of the mist like an armoured boxcar, its gun barrel jutting forward with a slow, arrogant sway. The crew rode shirtless despite the cold, their faces powdered white with propellant dust. When it halted beside the forward observer's post, the earth trembled from the idling engine. Its commander, a sergeant from Kansas named Tom Kepler, climbed down and slapped the gun's breech with proprietary affection. "She knocks," he said simply. The M12 was the American answer to a German riddle: how to breach concrete thicker than any shell burst could crumble. The bunkers of the Siegfried Line had been poured to survive months of bombardment: 8 feet of reinforced concrete, steel doors a foot thick, and gun embrasures that faced downslope so no direct hit could find them. Conventional artillery shredded the surface but left the skeleton intact. Engineers with satchel charges had to crawl up under fire to finish what the guns began. That was costly work, so the Americans brought the gun to the bunker's doorstep. The M12 carried the same 155mm Monet gun used by heavy field batteries, but mounted on the hull of an obsolete Sherman tank. It could move with the armor, take position behind the last fold of ground, and fire point-blank into the embrasure. The shell, weighing nearly 100 pounds, hit with enough kinetic energy to punch through 6 feet of reinforced concrete. Against a bunker wall, it didn't need penetration. The shock alone killed every man inside. The first time Raines saw one fire, he felt the concussion in his teeth. The crew wheeled it into position less than 200 yards from a German casemate that had resisted 2 days of indirect fire. Engineers marked the range, radioed coordinates, and then stepped back. Kepler's men loaded a single-shell supercharge, they called it, and pulled the lanyard. The gun leaped backward on its suspension, a gout of flame belching from the muzzle. Half a second later, the front of the bunker erupted outward like a kicked anthill. The shell didn't merely crack the concrete, it peeled it open. When infantry reached it minutes later, the defenders were already dead, their weapons still in firing position. That was the rhythm of the Siegfried battles: geometry from the rear, brutality up front. The time-on-target barrages shattered the ground, and the door knockers finished what the mathematics began. Engineers followed close behind, clearing the ruins for the riflemen. Each destroyed casemate exposed the next, and each new target brought another M12 lumbering forward, its tracks grinding through rubble. American reports from the 3rd Armored Division recorded that a single battery of M12s could reduce a fortified sector in minutes. During the assault on Pillbox Cluster No. 7 near Rötgen, 4 vehicles fired 32 rounds in less than 5 minutes. Observers counted 7 direct penetrations. The bunkers were reduced to dust. A German prisoner later told interrogators that he had thought they were under naval bombardment. What made the system terrifying was coordination. The M12s never worked alone. Behind them, Field Artillery Group 41 plotted every movement. As soon as one bunker was cracked, survey crews calculated the next range, and within moments the heavier guns behind the line dropped smoke and high-explosive shells to blind German counterfire. To the defenders, it appeared that the entire American front moved as one organism, claws of steel guided by a single mind. Raines sometimes rode the M12 forward to observe from its armor plate. The smell inside was a mixture of grease, cordite, and diesel. Every surface was blackened by soot. When the gun fired, the crew braced against the walls, grinning through the concussion. The recoil cylinders shrieked like tortured metal, and smoke poured out of the breech in blue ribbons. The men had learned to duck instinctively as shards of brick and concrete fell from the sky. They called those fragments German snow. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. To the Americans, the sight of those huge self-propelled guns rolling past meant progress proof that the line could be broken. To the Germans, it was despair made visible. Prisoners captured near Lammersdorf described entire platoons abandoning positions when they heard the first thunder of the door knockers. One sergeant told interrogators, "We thought they were bringing up railway guns." The bunker shook before the shell arrived. In the after-action reports of November 1944, commanders noted that infantry morale rose sharply when M12s were attached to an operation. Their presence meant the attack would not stall. The guns had become symbols of inevitability, the last argument of American artillery. The crews themselves paid for that power. They fought at ranges so short that counterfire from machine guns and mortars was constant. The M12's armor was thin, barely enough to stop rifle bullets. Shrapnel tore through side plates like paper. At Gehlenkirchen, a direct mortar hit ignited the peasants' propellant bags stacked beside an M12. The explosion hurled its barrel 100 feet, yet the survivors went on loading the remaining guns. When asked why, Sergeant Kepler shrugged. Because the next bunker is waiting. By the time the Allies reached the Ruhr River in December, there were fewer than 100 M12s left in service. But their legend had spread across every infantry regiment. Soldiers wrote home about the big guns on tank tracks that could unmake a fortress in a single shot. The Germans gave them a name of their own, Bunkerbrecher, bunker breaker. In post-war analysis, engineers concluded that the M12's effect was less from direct penetration than from overpressure. The concussion of its heavy shell, striking concrete at point-blank range, created a shock wave that multiplied inside enclosed chambers. Even when walls held, lungs ruptured, and eardrums burst. The report's language was clinical, but its conclusion simple. The first round was decisive. For Rains, who recorded those numbers in his worn notebook, it felt almost obscene how easily precision could become annihilation. The door knockers were the logical extension of everything the artillery had learned. Take the calculations that had erased bunkers from a distance and apply them face to face. He knew what would follow. Somewhere beyond the Rhine, stronger fortifications waited, and engineers were already designing heavier self-propelled guns to meet them. As the column of M12s clattered eastward that night, their tracks cutting deep into the frozen mud, Rains thought of what Sergeant Kepler had said the first day. She knocks. He understood now what that meant. The sound of those guns was not a question but an answer, a single deafening reply to every wall Germany had built to stop them. And when the echo faded, there was only silence, and a door left forever open. Every American gun crew carried a weapon more important than the howitzer, itself a watch. Wristwatches and stopwatches, synchronized with the precision of a surgeon's pulse, were what turned massed artillery from chaos into choreography. By the winter of 1944, it was said that an American battalion could set its watches by the second and kill by the minute. The fire direction system that governed those watches was the nervous system of the greatest artillery armada in history. Lieutenant Alan Rains first noticed how much the war depended on time when he visited a fire direction center near Stolberg. The room looked more like a bank vault than a battlefield post rows of steel desks, plotting boards, and phones labeled by color. A sergeant major stood before a master clock wired directly to a radio receiver that pulsed with faint static every 30 seconds, the signal from the master chronometer in London. "Every battery, every gun, every watch," he said to Rains. "Lives and dies on that tick." It was true. The American time, on target technique, required more than math, it required trust in synchronized seconds. A gunner might be 10 miles away, hearing only a voice over field telephone, yet his shell and those of 20 other guns had to arrive together within one heartbeat. The smallest error, one watch 10 seconds slow, one gun captain impatient, could ruin the entire illusion of simultaneous destruction. The precision came from a chain of discipline that ran backward through the echelons. The observer's call reached battalion fire direction, from there to group headquarters, and finally to the clockman, whose duty was sacred. Twice a day, at 0900 and 2100 hours, every battery synchronized by radio tone. At the mark, voices echoed across Europe. "Check time ready, mark." Hundreds of thousands of watches clicked together, an army's heartbeat. Rains watched as a plotting sergeant called out, "Flight time 37.5 seconds. Target number 1271. On a blackboard, assistants chalked distances, powder charges, fuse settings. A lieutenant checked wind corrections, shouted, "Time minus 45, and started a stopwatch. When it reached 0, every battery on the net fired. The shells would arrive exactly together. The room erupted in a chorus of pencils scratching, phones clicking, and men murmuring countdowns in unison, a choir of precision. This invisible synchronization extended across the entire front. The United States First Army's artillery, in December 1944, nearly 100 battalions, could coordinate fire, as though operated by a single hand. At Hurtgen, 500 guns had been linked in one massive time on target that landed 9,000 shells on the German positions in less than 10 seconds. Enemy survivors described it as one single explosion that never stopped. The German army had no equivalent. Their observers relied on wire lines often cut by shell fire, their clocks rarely synchronized across units. When American artillery struck, German return fire lagged by minutes. In those minutes, the battlefield had already changed. The American watch, not the American gun, was the true edge. The men who lived by those watches became part scientists, part ritualists. In the quiet before a fire mission, gun crews stood around the battery chronometer, comparing second hands under the glow of flashlights. "Mark on the 0, the chief of section would say. The instant the second hand crossed 12, a chorus answered, "Checked." To outsiders it looked absurd, but in that small word rested the fate of hundreds of men. Even in chaos, the ritual held. During the Ardennes counter-offensive that December, when snow clogged roads and batteries were scattered, the network still functioned. Forward observers, trapped in isolated pockets, radioed coordinates to guns they could not see, trusting their brothers in the rear to fire on time. When relief came, the snow was cratered like lunar rock where the shells had struck exactly as ordered. The Germans called it ghost fire salvos that appeared without ranging shots or warning. The timing discipline reached an almost religious intensity. Some artillerymen refused to remove their watches, even to sleep. They wound them with care, cleaned them with rags dipped in diesel, shielded them from shock. A broken crystal could mean delayed fire, and delayed fire could mean dead infantry. In post-war reports, quartermasters noted that more wristwatches were requisitioned for artillery units than for any other branch except pilots. They were as essential as powder and shell. To Rains, the cult of time seemed both magnificent and terrifying. These men had turned seconds into weapons. He remembered standing beside an M155 battery when a sergeant named Miller explained it. "We don't fight with guns, sir. We fight with clocks. The gun's just the instrument." That winter, as the push toward the Roer River began, the system reached its ultimate refinement. Artillery Group 41 planned a regimental time on target across an entire 5-mile sector. The order required 73 separate firing units to deliver 250 tons of explosives in the same 5-second window. The synchronization procedure began 48 hours before the first shell. Radio time signals were checked against the Army Air Force's network. Meteorological balloons provided wind data. Surveyors confirmed every gun's position to within 2 yards. At 07:30 on the chosen morning, a colonel pressed the master stopwatch. 10 miles of batteries responded like gears in a single machine. To the Germans in the bunkers, there was no warning. The barrage arrived whole, a single vast sound that rolled over the forest like thunder under glass. When it ended, the bunkers were gone, the trenches erased, the defenders silent. The report recorded only one sentence, and under effect. All enemy activity ceased within 10 seconds of initial impact. Afterward, Rains walked through the ruins. Amid the broken concrete and twisted steel, he found something almost absurd, a shattered German pocket watch, its hands frozen at 7:30 and 5 seconds. He kept it in his jacket pocket for the rest of the war. To him, it was proof of what the artillery had accomplished and what it had become. A war fought between seconds, where the side with the better watch struck first and lived. By spring, as the Rhine bridges fell and Germany collapsed, historians in uniform were already calling it the Clockwork War. For all the inventions of radar and rockets, nothing equaled the simple power of synchronized time. The gun that killed was only the echo of a tick that began miles away in a fire direction center, proof that in the modern battlefield, the most fearsome weapon was not the cannon's roar, but the heartbeat of a watch that never lost a second. By the spring of 1945, the thunder of American artillery was no longer confined to the earth. The sky itself had joined the bombardment. Air and ground had merged into a single destructive rhythm, the last and greatest evolution of time on target. What had begun as a trick of synchronized watches now extended upward, linking the Army's field batteries with the bomb bays of the 8th Air Force and the rocket tubes of fighter bombers streaking through German cloud. Lieutenant Alan Rains first witnessed this new orchestration outside Remagen, where the Ludendorff Bridge still clung to its shattered piers over the Rhine. For days, German batteries had shelled the bridgehead, hoping to destroy the only intact crossing into the heart of the Reich. American engineers worked beneath falling shells, patching girders with steel plates scavenged from wrecked trucks. Then, on March 7th, at 0900, the order came down. Combined time on target ground and air. Rains stood on a hillside above the river, with his field glasses pressed tight, watching as the horizon began to flicker. 40 miles to the rear, hundreds of guns prepared their tables. At the same instant, the radio frequencies of the 9th Air Force crackled with target coordinates identical to his own. Each bomber group adjusted its run so that their bomb release would coincide by stopwatch to the arrival of artillery shells. The mathematics were delicate: wind drift, bomb fall time, altitude, ballistic arcs. But the engineers at Fire Direction Headquarters had already solved the equation. At 0930, the stopwatch reached 0. The sky and the earth struck together. From the clouds came the scream of falling ordnance, 500-pound demolition bombs plunging like black raindrops. From the ground came the reply: the flat concussions of 155mm shells, fired at the same grid. The two storms met over the German gun line, merging in a single rolling concussion that turned the valley into a bowl of flame. When the smoke cleared, the German artillery positions were gone. Their guns had been dug into vineyards along the slope, invisible from the air, but the simultaneous strike from above and below had buried them completely. Later reconnaissance showed only cratered earth and the glint of twisted metal. The after-action report called it the first true three-dimensional time on target. This marriage of air and artillery had been years in the making. As early as Sicily, in 1943, American forward observers had experimented with calling fighter bombers onto the same coordinates as their own guns. The challenge was communication. Aircraft operated in minutes and miles, artillery in seconds and yards. By 1944, portable VHF radios and standardized target grids made coordination possible. A single forward observer could summon both rain and thunder, the steel rain, as infantrymen called it. The system's perfection came with Operation Grenade on the Ruhr River. There, the 15th Field Artillery Group worked directly with the 9th Air Force's rocket-firing P-47s. Each fighter squadron received the same fire table as the artillery batteries. When the gunners fired, the pilots began their dives, releasing rockets at the moment the shells arrived. German defenders reported that the explosions came from every direction at once. It was psychological warfare written in shock waves. Rains remembered the sound more than the sight. Artillery had its rhythm deep, percussive, like drums. But when the aircraft joined, the pitch rose into a mechanical chorus, rockets whistling, bombs howling, shells bursting, all perfectly overlapped. It felt less like combat than like machinery functioning exactly as designed. Each explosion was a moving part, each second a gear. The battlefield had become a clock whose hands pointed to annihilation. On March 10th, during the fighting for the Remagen bridgehead, this coordination reached its terrifying zenith. German armoured reinforcements from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division were assembling near Erpel, hidden among the orchards. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the columns just before dusk. Within an hour, the photographs had been converted into coordinates. At 0700 the next morning, the entire American artillery in the sector, nearly 700 guns, prepared a strike. Overhead, 200 fighter bombers formed into waves, each armed with 5-inch rockets and 250-pound bombs. When the order came, the sky and ground fused again. To the men on the riverbanks, it seemed the horizon had vanished in white light. From the far side of the Rhine, German prisoners later recalled, the sound was like the earth tearing open. Within 10 minutes, the orchard had become a crater field half a mile wide. When scouts advanced, they found trucks and half-tracks hurled into trees. Their engines still warm, but their crews gone. The bridgehead never again faced serious counterattack. By the last weeks of the war, this integrated system was doctrine. Fire direction centers issued their time signals not just to artillery but to air groups. Pilots flying at 20,000 feet carried synchronized watches marked with red lines denoting TOT ground zero. The British called it Victor time, the Americans Zulu synchronization. Whatever the name, it transformed warfare. The air and ground no longer supported each other, they were the same weapon, measured in seconds. The Germans, once masters of coordination, could only marvel. Prisoners told interrogators that they thought the Americans had developed new proximity fuses, or even atomic munitions. They could not comprehend the truth that precision and abundance had replaced invention. The Americans had simply extended the logic of their artillery into the sky. After the Day War, historians would write that the time-on-target principle reached its purest expression in those March days over the Rhine. It was not the most shells, nor the largest bombs, but the most perfect synchronization ever achieved in conventional warfare. Every explosion occurred within a single 10-second window across an area of 5 square miles. No German battery survived. Standing on the ridge after the barrage, Rains thought of how far the art had come since that first morning in the Hurtgen. Then, the guns had seemed like living beasts: smoke, fury, instinct. Now they were clockwork, each detonation predicted to the second, each target erased with mathematical certainty. The trick had become the language of modern war, and the sky had learned to speak it fluently. He wrote in his notebook that night, "When the sky answered the guns, the war was already decided. We had learned to make thunder obey the clock." The sentence was simple, but it captured what generations of gunners would later call the secret of victory: the ability to make the heavens and the earth strike the same note, at the same instant, until the enemy heard nothing but silence. The men who fought through the Ardennes in the winter of 1944 learned to fear what they couldn't see. The forest was dense, the snow heavy, the air thin and bitterly cold. For weeks, artillery duels had done little but scar the treetops and shake frost from branches. Then, sometime in late December, the sound changed. Instead of the usual whistling descent followed by a single thunderclap in the soil, shells began bursting overhead, sharp, metallic, almost instantaneous. Within seconds, the snow turned red. The Germans called it Luftsprenggranaten, airburst shells. The Americans called it something simpler: the new fuse. Lieutenant Alan Rains saw its effect for the first time near Elsenborn Ridge. A German counterattack had been forming beyond a line of pines. Men crouched behind snowbanks and half-buried tanks. Rains's observers adjusted their binoculars and radioed in coordinates for a defensive barrage. Usually, the shells would bury themselves and explode in muffled thumps, showering dirt and snow, but leaving the armoured infantry mostly unharmed. This time was different. The first salvo burst 20 yards above the ridgeline. Dozens of tiny detonations formed a horizontal curtain of flame and steel fragments. The snow below rippled as if swept by wind. When the smoke cleared, there was no movement. The enemy formation had been shredded in the open. Rains watched in stunned silence as another round of shells followed, detonating in mid-air, each burst precisely timed. "Proximity fuses," the battalion radio operator whispered. "They finally gave them to us." It was, in truth, one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war: the variable time, or VT, fuse. Inside what looked like an ordinary artillery shell was a tiny radar transmitter that emitted continuous radio waves. When those waves reflected from the ground or from the body of a man, the signal triggered detonation. No stopwatch, no guesswork, no adjustment. The shell sensed its own target and exploded at exactly the right height to maximize lethality. The science had been born not in battlefield laboratories but in universities: Johns Hopkins, MIT, and the Office of Scientific Research and Development. It required technology so delicate that early versions had to be assembled by hand under microscopes. Yet the US Navy had first tested it in 1942, using the new fuse to destroy Japanese aircraft during the battles for the Solomons. By 1944, production had reached millions of units. and the army finally received its share. The fuse changed the very geometry of war. Previously, artillery killed mainly by concussion-buried blasts that smashed trenches and collapsed roofs. The VT fuse turned each shell into a scythe of shrapnel that swept outward in a sphere. An infantry platoon caught in the open was annihilated before it could dive for cover. Even men inside bunkers suffered as fragments ricocheted through firing ports and ventilation shafts. Machine guns, mortars, even observation slits became death traps. The effect on German morale was catastrophic. Interrogation reports from captured soldiers in January 1945 spoke of shells that follow you. One sergeant from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division said his men began refusing to occupy tree lines, convinced the Americans had found a way to aim at their thoughts. Others described the sound, a faint crackle, then a tearing metallic shriek that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air itself exploded, one wrote in his diary. For the American artillerymen, the fuse required no new training, only new care. The tiny radar sets were sensitive to shock and moisture. Gunners learned to handle the shells as if they were glass, never dropping or jarring them. The fuses were issued in sealed canisters and mounted just before firing. Once in flight, the device was self-contained, humming invisibly as it searched for the world below. At Elsenborn, the first battalions to use them saw immediate results. German counterattacks that had previously taken hours to repel were smashed in minutes. Infantry officers began begging for VT shells in every fire mission. One after-action report noted that proximity fuses increased casualties by 300% in open-ground engagements. But beyond the statistics was the psychological transformation. For the first time, the Americans felt they controlled not just the ground, but the very air above it. By February, the fuse had been standardized across the Western Front. Field Artillery Headquarters issued strict orders. VT ammunition would not be used near Allied positions to prevent accidental airbursts over friendly troops. When used offensively, however, the results bordered on the surreal. During the crossing of the Ruhr River, Rhines coordinated a defensive screen with VT-fused shells along the far bank. Each burst appeared as a flickering ceiling of flame, forming what soldiers later called steel rainbows. German gunners attempting to return fire were cut down before they could adjust their sights. Even hardened veterans struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. Sergeant Tom Kepler, the same Kansas gunner who once commanded the M12 Door Knocker, watched a VT barrage from a captured hilltop and muttered, "It's like the sky's got teeth." His words spread through the regiment, and by the time they reached Rheins's headquarters, they had become prophecy. "The sky's got teeth" appeared scrawled on gun shields, helmets, and mess kits. The Germans tried desperately to develop countermeasures, aluminum chaff, reflective panels, even smoke screens, but none worked. The fuse detected solid surfaces, not light or heat. There was no hiding from it. In desperation, some German units reverted to fighting in cellars and tunnels, abandoning trenches altogether. But that only seeded the battlefield. The Americans could now sweep open terrain with complete impunity. At night, the effect was even more terrifying. Airbursts lit the darkness with chains of white fire, each spark descending like a comet tail of molten metal. Infantrymen advancing beneath these barrages spoke of the sensation as walking under lightning that kills sideways. For Rhines, it was both awe and horror. He realized that time on target, once dependent on synchronized watches, had evolved into something autonomous. The shells themselves now kept their own time, each one a tiny clock that stopped the instant it sensed life. When the war ended months later, the captured German reports on VT fuses were explicit. "This weapon removes all advantage of cover," one officer wrote. "Our positions no longer exist in depth, but only in duration seconds." The post-war Allied assessment was even starker. The proximity fuse shortened battles, saved lives, and hastened victory by months. Rhines kept one of the spent fuse casings from that winter, its nose dented, its circuitry burned out. To him, it was the symbol of the war's final transformation, the moment when technology stopped supporting the soldier and instead replaced him. The fuse had made gunners into gods of distance. It was the last evolution of the trick that had begun with watches and stopwatches. The Americans no longer merely synchronized time, they commanded it, detonating death itself with the precision of a second hand. By March of 1945, the Siegfried Line, the same wall that had once symbolized the invincibility of Germany, was collapsing like an old dam under too much pressure. The Americans no longer fought against bunkers, they fought through them. What had once required hours of siege and human sacrifice was now accomplished in the time it took to light a cigarette. Lieutenant Alan Rains had seen enough fortifications by then to know their pattern by heart. The reinforced concrete, the sloped embrasures, the interlocking fire zones. They had been built for a slower age, an age of methodical war, of creeping barrages and engineers inching forward with explosives strapped to their chests. But in 1945, the very physics of destruction had changed. The artillery no longer crept. It arrived, whole and simultaneous, from every compass point, every elevation, and even from the sky. The bunkers never stood a chance. The trick, as always, lay in timing. The time-on-target system had matured into something almost automatic. Fire direction centers used field computers' steel slide rules known as computers M10 to synchronize hundreds of guns within seconds. Proximity fuses took care of the rest. When the order came to breach the Westwall near Saarbrücken, 3 divisions, worth of artillery, more than 1,000 pieces were assigned to a single target zone less than 2 miles wide. Each gun fired at pre-calculated intervals so that every shell, regardless of its origin, arrived in the same 3-second window. At 06:30 on March 15th, the guns began. Rains stood on the forward ridge, watching the horizon become liquid. The shells did not fall like rain, they materialized. The first wave struck the upper slopes, airbursts hammering the German trenches that protected the main fortifications. A second wave of heavier 240mm shells, fitted with concrete-piercing caps, arrived a heartbeat later. The ground under Rains's boots shook as though the earth itself were breathing. Each impact threw up geysers of dirt mixed with chunks of rebar and men. Within 10 minutes, the entire German line was swallowed by smoke. When the infantry advanced, they found not bunkers, but impressions of bunkers' cavities in the soil where once stood, walls 8 feet thick. The overpressure from the simultaneous detonations had liquefied the concrete. It was not merely destroyed, it was erased. Engineers estimated that each emplacement had been struck by at least 20 direct hits within those 3 seconds. No human structure, no matter how reinforced, could have survived. Prisoners captured later that day described the experience in tones of disbelief. "There was no beginning," said a German lieutenant from the 347th Infantry Division. "The shells did not start, they were already there. We heard nothing. One moment we stood, the next, there was only light." Others claimed that entire gun crews vanished without trace, their weapons found buried, barrels bent backward from the force. The Americans had coined a new term for the phenomenon: bunker flashover. It referred to the simultaneous ignition of every combustible element inside a sealed fortification: air, oil, powder, oxygen, when struck by multiple, overlapping blasts. The internal pressure climbed to hundreds of pounds per square inch. Those inside didn't even have time to scream. The same principle that engineers once used to demolish bridges was now applied to living men. Rains felt no triumph in it. He was a professional soldier, trained to admire efficiency, but as he walked through the aftermath, the silence was unnerving. Concrete dust hung in the morning light like snow. The smell was unlike gunpowder or fuel. It was acrid, metallic, like ozone after a thunderstorm. He could not tell where the bunkers had stood except for the fragments of rebar protruding from the ground like broken bones. Behind him, a corporal from the 94th Division muttered, "Hell, they didn't even die, they just ceased." It was an exaggeration, but not by much. Of the 400 Germans manning that sector, fewer than 50 were taken alive. Most were found days later, buried in collapsed tunnels or sealed chambers. By nightfall, the American engineers had moved their bulldozers forward to fill craters and lay down corduroy roads for the tanks. The fortifications that had taken Germany years to build were reduced to an afternoon's work to clear away. The war had inverted itself. Concrete, once the weapon of defense, had become a liability. To fortify was to invite the storm. Rhine scribbled one final note in his field journal that evening, his handwriting unsteady from exhaustion and shock. They built bunkers to stop time. We built time to stop them. It was, in a sense, the perfect epitaph for the war's transformation. The trick, that began as a coordination of watches, had grown into a force that erased the very idea of defense. By mastering the seconds, the Americans had conquered the walls, and with them, the illusion that anything man-made could withstand the arithmetic of their guns. By the final weeks of the war, the sound of American artillery had become something more than noise. It was a law. Every explosion, every ripple of flame, every collapsing wall obeyed a calculation that had been refined across continents and campaigns. To Lieutenant Alan Rains, who had spent 2 years watching those calculations turn into craters, the battlefield no longer looked chaotic. It looked solved. The Germans were still fighting stubbornly, brilliantly in places, but their equations were wrong. They had built for endurance, bunkers, trenches, and armor measured in inches of steel. The Americans fought in seconds. The side that mastered time had no need for walls. On April 1st, 1945, Rains visited a fire direction center near Cassel that represented the pinnacle of this new warfare. It was underground, built into a commandeered wine cellar, its walls lined with field telephones, slide rules, and maps marked in overlapping arcs of fire. At its heart stood the thing that made it all possible, a massive wall chart called the time graph. Dozens of clocks ticked across its face, each corresponding to a different artillery group. Wires from those clocks led out through the ceiling to the field lines and onward to batteries scattered across 20 miles. Every few minutes, a radio operator relayed corrections from forward observers. As each message came in, clerks moved colored pins on the graph, shifting impact times by seconds. It was like watching an orchestra tune itself between notes. When the final order came, fire mission, corps wide, time on target, the room stilled. The major in command pressed his thumb against a master stopwatch and said quietly, "Gentlemen, synchronize." At that instant, the room became pure rhythm, the scratch of pencils, the muttered countdowns, the simultaneous clicks of 100 stopwatches. Then the major's voice again. Fire. Rains stepped outside and looked east. The landscape beyond the river was already ruined, but what followed made it seem to vanish anew. The entire horizon pulsed with light as 1,200 guns fired in perfect unison. It was not a rolling barrage, it was an instantaneous one. Within 5 seconds, nearly 20,000 shells struck an area less than 3 square miles wide. The shockwave came a heartbeat later, lifting dust and frost from the fields, shaking the steel doors of the cellar behind him. When the sound finally faded, the valley was gone. The guns had unmade it. The reports afterward were almost sterile. Target zone Orange 1 neutralized. Enemy artillery silenced. Resistance minimal. No mention of the men inside those coordinates, or the fact that nothing in nature or architecture could have survived a bombardment timed to the half-second. The mathematics had become impersonal. It had no room left for witness. The Germans knew it too. Intelligence intercepts revealed their growing despair. A message from the remnants of the 5th Parachute Division, recorded April 2nd, read, "Enemy fires all, calibers, as one. Impossible to seek shelter. Sound arrives after destruction." That phrase, after destruction, haunted Rains more than anything else he'd read. It meant that even the human sense of cause and effect had been reversed. You died before you heard the shot. After the war, historians would call this the culmination of American fire control doctrine. It combined every lesson learned since North Africa meteorology, ballistics, radio timing, computing into a single devastating instrument. A corps commander could now annihilate an enemy regiment without ever seeing it, without adjusting fire, and without firing more than once. The numbers were staggering. Each corps-wide time on target consumed roughly 1 million pounds of ammunition, moved by 5,000 trucks, calculated by 50 officers, and executed by the synchronized wrists of 30,000 men. Yet for all its precision, it was still human, powered by muscle, discipline, and routine. Gunners stood in ankle-deep mud, hands raw from loading shells. Radio operators tuned dials through static. Observers like Rains squinted through smoke that stung their eyes. The machines had not replaced them, they had merely extended them. The trick of synchronization worked only because men believed in it enough to obey the second hand without question. On April 8th, when word spread that the German army west of the Elbe was collapsing, Rains looked down at his own watch, the same battered Elgin he'd carried since the first time on target on the Westwall. The crystal was cracked, the hands blackened by smoke, but it still ticked perfectly. He realized that it had measured not just the hours of the campaign, but its logic, every advance, every destruction, every silence that followed. That night, as the guns finally ceased firing, he wrote one last entry in his journal. "We did not win by firepower alone. We won by rhythm." The gunners turned time into a weapon, and once they did, everything else, walls, armor, even courage, became obsolete. The clock struck, and empires fell. The next morning, the sky over Germany was clear for the first time in months. There were no contrails, no thunder. Just a silence measured in seconds, the pause between one age of war ending and another waiting to begin.